Unfortunately, these are dramatic times. Europe might very well be on its way to destruction. The Europe you know from a tourist point of view, of the Europe you know from the stories of your parents, of friends, of families, is on the verge of collapsing. We are now witnessing profound changes that will forever alter Europe's destiny and might send our continent in what Ronald Reagan once called 1,000 years of darkness. The takeover of Europe is part of the global fight of Islam for world domination. Islam is a political ideology. Islam's heart lies at the Quran, and the Quran is a book that calls for hatred, that calls for violence, that calls for murder, that calls for war, that calls for submission. And the Quran asks and orders Muslims to kill non-Muslims. The Quran describes Jews as monkeys and pigs.
تعرفي اليهود؟ بتحبيهم؟ لا ما بتحبيهمش ليه؟
كده
عشان هم ايه؟
هم قردة وخنازير.
عشان هم قردة وخنازير؟ مين قال عليهم كده؟
ربنا.
قال عليهم فين؟
القرآن.
قال عليهم في القرآن كده.
The Quran is Allah's personal word, which leaves no room at all for interpretation. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, there is no such thing as a moderate Islam. Sure, there are moderate Muslims, but there is no moderate Islam. Muhammad was a warlord, and in establishing Islam, he preached violence. He preached the slaughter of non-Muslims. He took part in 78 battles and slaughtered the Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayza. And Muhammad said, and I quote, "I have been ordered by Allah to fight against people until they testify that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger." The purest joy in Islam is to kill and to be killed. And ladies and gentlemen, Muhammad's behavior and the Quran inspire until today jihadists from all over the world to slaughter innocent people, like in Washington, in New York, in Madrid, in London, in Amsterdam and in Mumbai. The truth is that Islam has always attempted to conquer Europe, and it has done so for centuries. The Christian city of Constantinople fell, as we all know, in the 15th century. And now, in the 21st century, Islam is trying again. This time not with armies, but through the application of al-Hijra, the Islamic doctrine of migration. This doctrine, al-Hijra, is based on the example of Muhammad, who, as you know, migrated from Mecca to Medina. And the Libyan leader, Muhammad al-Gaddafi, said, and I quote him, "We have today 50 million Muslims in Europe. There are signs that Allah will grant them victory in Europe without swords, without guns, without conquest. Those 50 million Muslims of Europe will turn Europe into a Muslim continent within a few decades." For the first time in world history, there are dozens of millions of Muslims living far outside the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world, and that poses an enormous threat to us in the West. Ladies and gentlemen, the al-Hijra may be the end of the Western civilization as we know it. My country is in the process of becoming Hollandistan, as Europe, as Badior stated correctly, is becoming Eurabia. And let me give you a few examples. Only 12% of the German Muslims see themselves more Germans than Muslims. And churches all over Europe, churches are emptying out, whereas mosques are shooting up like mushrooms. Medieval phenomena as burqas, as honor killings, as female genital mutilation are becoming more and more prevalent.
An hour before this footage was recorded, her father had tried to murder her. A month later, he succeeded. Banaz Mahmoud was just 20 years old.
She just wanted to get out of it, be a free person, be allowed to get out of the house when she wanted to. You know, not be locked up and be told what to do.
But that attitude was too much for her father. He beat his daughters with his shoe and called them whores just for wearing makeup. When he discovered Banaz had a secret boyfriend, Mahmoud and his brother Ari decided to murder them both. On New Year's Eve 2005, here in South Wimbledon, passers-by found Banaz running through the street, covered in blood and pleading for help. Banaz made her way to a cafe down here on the main road and the police were called. PC Angela Corns was the first officer in attendance. Now, PC Corns was unsympathetic when Banaz told her how she'd been plied with brandy and how her father had then tried to kill her. Instead, PC Corns wrote in her notebook that Banaz was being melodramatic. Banaz Mahmoud was strangled in her own home, her body crammed into a large suitcase. It was then transported north to Birmingham and buried in a hole 5 feet deep in the back garden of this house. It was 3 months before her body was found.
Sharia statements, Sharia testaments, Sharia mortgages, Sharia schools, Sharia banks, yes, even in the United Kingdom, Sharia courts and even Sharia Barbie dolls. We all have it in Europe today. And then I have not even mentioned that, for instance, in Denmark, in the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, 70% of the crimes are committed by Muslims. Ladies and gentlemen, we let in the Trojan horse. And allow me to give you a few examples that it's also happening not only in Europe but also in your country, in the United States. Muslim taxi drivers in Minneapolis airport have already refused more than 5,000 passengers because they were carrying alcohol. Muslim students are demanding separate camping housing. Muslim women are demanding separate hours in gyms and in swimming pools. Schools already here in the United States have been banning Halloween and Christmas celebrations. Schools are taking pork off their cafeteria menus to avoid Muslim students, to offend them. Ladies and gentlemen, please be aware that everything I mention is just the beginning. If things continue like this, you will have the same problems as we currently have in Europe. If we do not stop the Islamization, we will lose everything. We will lose our identity, we will lose our culture, our democratic constitutional state, our freedom, and indeed our civilization. And in Europe, we are already losing the right of free speech, the right to criticize Islam. Ladies and gentlemen, there is one Western country that has been forced to fight the forces of jihad for its values since the beginning, the very first day of its existence. And that is the State of Israel. I love Israel. However, in Europe, being pro-America and being pro-Israel makes you almost an endangered species. But Israel, ladies and gentlemen, is a beacon of light in an area, the Middle East, that is pitch black everywhere else. Israel is a Western democracy. Very important point I want to make for you. The so-called Middle East conflict is not about land at all. It is not a territorial conflict. It's a conflict about ideologies. It's a battle between Islam and freedom. It's not about some land in Gaza or Judea and Samaria. To Islam, the whole of Israel is occupied territory. They see Jerusalem and Haifa as settlements too. Islam forces Israel to fight. And Israel is not just fighting for itself. Israel is fighting for all of us. We all are Israel. Israel fights for the entire West. Just like those brave American soldiers who landed in Sicily in 1943 and stormed the Normandy beaches in 1944, young Israeli men and women are fighting today for our freedom, for our civilization. The elites that rule our societies, our so-called leaders, have converted to the sick ideology and the sick philosophy a long time ago that all cultures are equal. Government leaders, judges, even some churches, trade unions, university, the media, all of them are blinded by the political correctness and have chosen the side of Islam. Well, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, all cultures are not equal. Our culture that is based on Christianity, Judaism and humanism is far better than the Islamic culture. And many politicians seem to believe that their job is not to defend democracy and freedom, but to help to make the transition into Sharia law as smooth as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, I am often asked whether I have any answers to the problems and what those might be. Well, let me tell you, I certainly have the answers, even though many people in Europe don't like them, at least from the political elite. Let me tell you and mention a few of them. Things that we have to do to stop the Islamization of the West. The first thing, indeed, is to stop the cultural relativism. I believe we need in all our constitution, we need an article that lays down that we have one dominant culture that is based on Judaism, Christianity and humanism. Second, we have to stop pretending that Islam is a religion. Islam is not a religion. Islam is a totalitarian ideology. Islam wants to rule every aspect of society and every part of any person's life. Therefore, Islam should not be compared with other religions like Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism, but Islam should be compared with other totalitarian ideologies like communism or fascism. And if we would acknowledge the fact that Islam is not a religion but an ideology, it means also that the right to all these religious freedoms do not apply to Islam. Ladies and gentlemen, a very important thing to do, and I proposed it in the Dutch parliament many times, is to stop the mass immigration from Muslim countries. And in order to preserve our own values, our own identity and our own culture, not one person from Muslim countries should be allowed to emigrate to our societies anymore. Let us also be tough on those people who do not want to integrate. For people who are already in our societies and are from Muslim and Islamic background, let me tell to them that if they adhere to our values, to our constitutions, that they are welcome to stay and they are equal as anybody else, since we have no hate to any person whatsoever. But as soon as they have an idea that they think about Sharia, that they think about jihad, that they commit criminal acts, we tell them, we expel them, we tell them, there is the door, you have to leave our societies. And I also believe that every member of a non-Western country that wants to come or already is in our societies should sign a legally binding contract of assimilation and pledge of allegiance to our societies. And ladies and gentlemen, we also have to stop the building of new mosques in our societies. And I believe we should not allow one brick for one mosque to be built in our Western society as long as no churches or no synagogues are being allowed in countries like Saudi Arabia. And we also have to close down the worst institution in our societies, at least in Europe, the fascist institution of Islamic schools. Ladies and gentlemen, schools where young children who should assimilate and become full members of our society are being raised with an ideology of hate, with an ideology of terror. We should close down all the Islamic schools. And as a last example, and maybe one of the most important examples, I think we have to get rid of our current weak leaders. We have no leaders anymore. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. In short, we have to go on the offensive and we have to start fighting back. We must no longer allow ourselves to remain seated in our armchairs and get trampled over. If they bombard us with sharia law, we will bombard them back with our human rights. If they bombard us with our court cases, we will bombard them back with our court cases. We have, ladies and gentlemen, finally we have to start fighting back and show that millions of people all over the world are sick and tired of it all and refuse to take any more. We must make it clear that millions of freedom-loving people are saying enough is enough. Ladies and gentlemen, we all have to struggle, and indeed it is a struggle. After fitna has been screened for the first time last year, there were many threats to economical boycotts to my country, the Netherlands. The beautiful Dutch flag was burned all over the Middle East. Indeed, I am myself being prosecuted by my own government in my own country. While countries as France and Jordan are also considering to prosecute me. I have been barred on the kind invitation of my friend and colleague Lord Malcolm Pearson to enter the United Kingdom. I will never be allowed to enter the Republic of Indonesia anymore. The most radical imam in the Netherlands is also demanding huge compensation and suing me. A parliamentary bill currently in my own country, the Netherlands, is drafted with the aim of protecting Islam for criticism. And on top of all this, and it's not only about me, a lot of people who criticize Islam get a lot of threats. Al-Qaeda is determined to kill me. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I have not forgotten those to whom we owe our liberties. Our liberties were bitterly fought for. American soldiers fought, bled and died. American soldiers fought, bled and died for European freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, American soldiers did not die for an Islamized Europe, they died for a free Europe. Everything that we stand for has to be defended with all our might, our identity, our culture, our values, our democracy, our freedom, our civilization. Ladies and gentlemen, we owe it to our children and their children.
This is a Friday in Paris, filmed by hidden camera. The streets are blocked by a huge crowd of Muslim worshippers, and it's enforced by private security. This is all illegal in France: the public worship, the blocked streets, and the private security. But the police have been ordered not to intervene. It shows that even though some in the French government want to get tough with the Muslims and ban the burqa, other parts of the French government continue to give Islam privileged status. An ordinary French citizen who was watching the Islamization of Paris decided that the world needed to see what was happening to his city. So he bought a hidden camera and started posting the videos on YouTube. His life has been threatened, and so we're concealing his identity. He uses the alias of Maxime Lepant.
They are blocking the streets with barriers. They are praying on the ground, and the inhabitants of this district cannot leave their home nor go into their home during those prayers. The Muslims who are taking over those streets do not have any authorization. They do not go to the police headquarters, so it's completely illegal.
These Muslims have been granted unofficial rights that no Christian group is likely to get under France's laïcité or secularism law.
So it says people have the right to share any belief they want, any religion, but they have to practice at home or in the mosque, synagogues, churches, and so on.
Some say these Muslims must pray in the street because they need a larger mosque, but Maxime has observed cars coming from other parts of Paris, and he believes it's a weekly display of Muslim power.
They are coming there to show that they can take over some French streets, to show that they can conquer a part of the French territory.
If France faces an Islamic future, it took a Russian to write about it. It's the best-selling novel The Mosque of Notre Dame, 2048, a bestseller in Russia, not in France. The French publisher Jean Robin says the French media ignored the book for being politically incorrect.
So Islam is seen as the religion of the poor people. And so you can't say to the poor people, you're wrong, otherwise you're a fascist. That's how it goes.
The book lays out a dark future when France has become a Muslim nation and the famous cathedral has been turned into a mosque. Whether that plot is far-fetched depends on whom you ask. Muslims are said to be no more than 10% of the French population, although no one knows for sure because French law prohibits population counts by religion. But the birth rate for Muslims is significantly higher than for native French. Some Muslim men are said to practice polygamy, a charge this man faced, in some cases with each extra wife having children and collecting a welfare check.
With Islam, it's not only a problem of numbers. The problem of Islam is a problem of really principles. Is Islam a political ideology, or is it just a creed?
French philosopher Radu Stănescu is an Islamic expert who debates Muslim leaders on French TV.
It doesn't matter how many they are. The problem is the people who follow Islam are there somehow in a political party who has a political agenda, which means basically implementing sharia and build an Islamic state.
From the 1980s until just recently, it was a social taboo to criticize or oppose Islam, and so the government and media effectively helped Islam spread throughout the country.
We were expecting Islam to adapt to France. Now it's France adapting itself to Islam.
About the veil, this Muslim says Europeans should respect Muslim dress. This woman says the veil is in the Quran, and we only submit to God, and nobody else. Even if many government elites in France are in denial over Islam, the people in the streets increasingly are not. And they're becoming fed up with what they see as the growing Islamization of this country. They've started staging pork and wine aperitifs or cocktail parties in the street. They're patriotic demonstrations meant to strike back against Islam. Another national demonstration is planned for this Saturday. It looks as if a public backlash against Islam has begun. The French Parliament will debate a new burqa law this month. And this French leader has a warning for the West and for America.
We cannot accept the development of such practice because it's not compatible with the life in a modern society, you see? And this question is not only a French question. You will all have to face this challenge.
Dale Hurd, CBN News, Paris.
A Another factor in understanding this administration's policy of appeasement is its relationship with an organization you may not have heard of before, one of the largest, most powerful organizations in the world, and you should know its name. It's called the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, Organization for Islamic Cooperation, OIC, and so far it's gone virtually unnoticed. Who are they? The OIC is the second largest intergovernmental organization in the world after the United Nations. The OIC claims they have authority to represent all Muslims, even those who live in non-Muslim countries like the United States. In 2005, this very influential Islamic organization published a 10-year plan of action in 2005 to implement its Sharia-based speech code requirements worldwide. Listen very carefully to what I'm telling you right now. It explains this week. They had a 10-year plan of action to implement their Sharia-based, Islamist-based speech code requirements worldwide. But don't take my word for it. They published this plan on their website in English so no one would miss their intent. They intend to internationally criminalize all communication or any communication or speech that's deemed by them to be insulting to Islam, even in countries like the United States. That, my friends, explains the story of this week. Islamic enforced speech codes. No one, not Muslims, not non-Muslims, not Americans, are allowed to say anything Islamists see as insulting to their religion. They intend to force us to kiss our freedom of speech and religion goodbye, and that's why we're being forewarned today. Unbelievably, last December, they succeeded with both President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's help because they pushed through the United Nations the passage of UN Resolution 1618, which called upon all countries to enact laws preventing derogatory references to Islam, a clear violation of our First Amendment freedom of speech. And even before that, in last October, many prominent Islamic organizations wrote a letter to the White House where they urged our White House to do a complete purge of any federal training materials from references to the ideology of Islam, to ensure that all trainers in our U.S. military, our FBI, and other U.S. security agencies be retrained so they would be brainwashed in political correctness toward Islam. That's enforced Islamic speech codes here in the United States, and all done with the help of our President and Secretary of State. It took only days for the Obama administration to reply to this demand letter from the Islamists, promising to set up a task force with these same organizations to immediately begin this unprecedented purge of our counterterrorism training in every federal agency across the board. It's breathtaking, never been done before. But when members of Congress, myself included, started to ask questions about the identities of who these people were who were leading this purge in our government and what it was they were purging from our training materials, the Obama administration told us the information was closed. It was classified. We couldn't know who was behind this. I'm here to say, my friends, that we're now today very late in the game. We're quickly losing our sense of who we are as a nation, and we're losing our ability to identify our radical Islamist enemy. The time has come to stand unashamedly this week for our freedom and our values and draw an unmistakable red line for our enemies across the world.
There is a major effort taking place to curb free speech in this country, irrespective of our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. And free speech advocates say the United Nations has come down on precisely the wrong side. The United Nations has adopted what it calls a resolution combating defamation of religions. The United Nations now wants to make that anti-blasphemy resolution binding on member nations, including, of course, our own. That would make it a crime in the United States if the United Nations were to have its way to criticize religion, in particular, Islam. Kitty Pilgrim has our report.
The UN General Assembly is considering a binding resolution urging member states to make it a crime to criticize Islam.
What they would do would be to make it illegal to put out a movie or write a book or a poem which somebody could say was defamatory of Islam.
The so-called anti-blasphemy resolution would call on governments to pass their own laws to determine what can be said about religion in public. The resolution urges states to provide within their respective legal and constitutional systems adequate protection against acts of hatred, discrimination, intimidation, and coercion resulting from defamation of religion. But the U.S. says the concept of defamation of religion has another meaning. While appearing in name to promote tolerance, the implementation of this concept actually fosters intolerance and has served to justify restrictions on human rights and fundamental freedoms. Even talking about the influence of Islam on terrorism could be called criminal under this resolution if adopted by an individual country.
You are entitled to say that in America, but not if the UN has its way. They would criminalize that kind of practice, and they are trying to do it elsewhere around the world.
A group of 57 Organization of Islamic Countries, the largest bloc at the United Nations, has been pushing it out of concern, it says, over anti-Islamic behavior, saying this resolution is a major step towards sensitizing the international community on the serious impact of defamation of religions. Last December, the General Assembly passed it as a non-binding resolution. And this year, a binding resolution is expected to be introduced as early as March. Human rights activists say its influence is already being felt.
There have been a number of prominent cases, most recently in India, for instance, the editor of a newspaper was charged for reprinting an article that had initially been printed in the UK.
While the article mentioned the three major religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the editor was arrested for, quote, hurting the religious feelings of Muslims. Now, essentially what this resolution would do is to urge countries to pass laws in their country which would be unconstitutional in the United States and basically violate the spirit of many Western judicial systems, Lou.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One is, of those 57 nations supporting this resolution, how many of them are democracies?
I couldn't tell you, but many of them are Islamic countries. Pakistan has led the charge on this and has tabled this resolution.
So they're not democracies, and they're fascinated with their own precepts about what would constitute the way to run a nation, not like ours. Is there any discussion, or perhaps of simply, if the United Nations insists on doing this, sort of bulldozing the building, getting it out of the way, and letting them go find another place to live?
It wasn't really discussed in my my discussions today.
Well, perhaps we can raise that as an alternative to impinging on our constitutional liberties. Kitty Pilgrim, thank you very much. Appreciate it. From the United Nations. What a place. Well, joining me now with more on the UN effort to stifle free speech, to squelch it, really, is Christopher Hitchens. He's Vanity Fair columnist, author of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Christopher, I have to say, first, welcome. Great to have you back with us. Secondly, how dare these people attempt such a thing?
Well, first, thank you for having me back. And second, look, the claim of Islam is that it is the last and final revelation from God to humanity. That's quite a big claim to make, that you don't need another book after the Quran. You don't need any more evidence. You don't need any more argument. It's all done for you. Now, that's okay if people want to claim that. But now they want to say, if you have any difficulty with this idea, if you have any doubts about it, you're not allowed to express them. Because if you do, you are insulting us. You're making us feel hurt. Now, just imagine those two claims put together. One, a fantastic claim, and the other, a fantastic claim that you can't challenge. That is totalitarianism defined. It's a rape and butchery of the First Amendment of our Constitution.
It's also being joined, though, Christopher, by a lot of nations that are not Islamic, and there seems to be a strong move forward, and it's already, in point of fact, been approved at this level by the United Nations. I have to say that we're reaching a point in the United States where we've got a group of people who will go around clucking, saying, oh, yes, this will be just fine, irrespective of our constitutional rights, because there's some, we have Americans now. There is a movement afoot in this country for hidebound orthodoxy of all sorts of extremes, politically, religiously, in which people say, the heck with the Constitution, there are higher issues at order here.
You're quite right about that. I mean, when Salman Rushdie was sentenced to death by a senile theocrat in Iran for writing a novel, the Archbishop of Canterbury, His Holiness the Pope, certainly the Sephardic Chief Rabbi of Israel, and many other religious figures joined with Khomeini, not in exactly endorsing the fatwa, the death sentence, but in saying the problem was blasphemy. That they agreed with the Ayatollah to that extent. The problem was not the destruction of free speech and free expression, but the hurt feelings of the religious. This is a common problem. In Britain, there's a blasphemy law that only protects Christians, for example. It's a big source of Muslim grievance. But when you clear away all these discrepancies, there's one overwhelming thing that's happening, and it's this. There are Muslims who are prepared to use violence at the drop of a hat. If a cartoon is published in Denmark, if the Pope makes an off-the-cuff remark, a stupid one in my opinion, about Byzantium or the Crusades, they go straight to violence, but yet you cannot criticize them for being violent, lest you be accused of blasphemy.
Yeah, and it is well, Islam, of course, Christianity, whatever it may be. The United Nations is getting a bit burdensome, it seems to me, to anyone who's interested in freedom. Whether it be through the World Trade Organization, whether it be all sorts of institutions, organizations, ranging in issue from global warming to anti-blasphemy.
Yes.
This is becoming a totalitarian, authoritarian organization. And political correctness is really an effort to control, more seemingly to me at least, nothing more than an effort to control thought.
Nothing to do with its remit either, which is the settlement of disputes among member states by peaceful means. Of course, nothing to do with that at all. And remember, thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, all member states or applicants for membership of the UN were not compelled, but were strongly urged to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, among other things, protects freedom of expression. And the countries that refused could still join, but remember that they were the then Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia. Those were the countries that said we would rather not have to think of universal human rights. Universal human rights exist, whether religion recognizes them or not. And we have to stand up for this. Yeah. And we have to better start standing up for it now, I would say, against theocracy.
Well, let me ask you, in the course of the last several days, to my knowledge, I've been the only one in the national, I will put it this way, electronic media that has challenged Reverend Al Sharpton on the issue of the First Amendment, seeking the firing and actually the intervention of the federal government on the New York Post because of a cartoon that was lame, as I've said, insensitive, and I thought demonstration of bad judgment, but not racist. Where in the world has the national liberal media been on that issue?
It was a very crummy cartoon, I have to say.
Absolutely.
But I can't imagine what they were doing. It wasn't... another crime, by the way, it wasn't funny. I mean, can we just say that that's also an offense?
I started out with lame.
Extreme, yeah. Being unfunny is a fantastic failure in a cartoonist.
And I think we should have people's heads every time they don't perform.
The federal government has no competence in these matters.
Right.
And it can't be solicited for this. Now, just scroll back a bit. I've been to Friday prayers in Tehran.
Right.
Several times.
Christopher, I'm going to have to leave you at prayers
organized chanting of death to America, death to Britain, death to Israel. Its head of state is allowed to come to the UN. That's fine by me, but don't let them tell me that only those who criticize them are being blasphemous.
Yep. Well, I have to say that my patience is ending primarily with the United Nations that's arrogant enough to think it should leave us subservient to its collective will. Christopher Hitchens, always good to have you here. Wish we had more time.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay. Well, we want to know what you think. Our poll question tonight is, do you believe the United Nations restriction of freedom of speech in the United States should be tolerated? Yes or no? Cast your vote at BlueDimes.com. We'll have the results here later. 98% of you say the United Nations restriction of freedom of speech in the United States should not be tolerated. And I'm thinking about bulldozers, but that's an addendum.